Hello students, and in today's class I want to take some time and introduce you to the cells of the nervous system. As we delve into the cells of the nervous system, I want to remind you about the basic structure of the animal cell and remind you that not almost all, every single living thing is composed of cells. So we are focusing in this course particularly on the brain. And as we've told you, the brain consists of billions of cells. But when you consider the entire body, well, the entire body has many, many, many billions of cells. And while the cells of the nervous system are specialized cells and they have been uniquely configured to perform their function, I want to remind you of some typical features of all animal cells. And we just want to briefly review some of these features: the cell membrane, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the ribosomes, and the endoplasmic reticulum. There are many other cell organelles that I'd like you to read about, but let's just review these ones briefly. So let's begin with the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane is a structure that separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. If you were to think of a house, the equivalent structure in a house is the wall. So if you imagine the cell as a house, the cell membrane represents the walls. And the walls serve several functions. First of all, the walls allow the internal environment of your house to exist in a different space from the external environment. So outside it might be noisy, it might be dirty, there might be lots of volume. Inside, everything of your home might be full of peace and calm and tidiness. The division, the thing that regulates the outside from the inside, is the cell membrane. This is very, very important because it gives rise to two terms that we talk about. We refer to the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. And they have different chemical compositions, which are very, very important for the functioning of the human body. And having the cell membrane allows that division to take place. If we press on, though, with the analogy of the house, walls without openings to allow things to move in and out are a bit useless. It's a little bit like Rapunzel's tower. And so walls have openings that can allow light, that can allow wind. They have doors that can allow human beings to pass in and out. In the same way, the cell membrane also has openings that regulate the movement of substances from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. And these openings are called channels, and you can see them in the diagram here to the right. All of these channels tend to be made up of protein with pores in the middle of them that allow substances to move in and out. And these channels are often very specific, only allowing particular substances to pass in and out. So you might talk about a sodium channel that only allows the sodium ions to move in and out, or a potassium channel that only allows the potassium ion access. So that briefly describes the cell membrane. There's a lot more that we could say about the cell membrane, and I'll encourage you to do some extra reading on your own. The last thing I will say is the cell membrane is made up of structures called phospholipids. These molecules have a fatty portion, or portion that's composed of fatty acids, which make up lipids and fats. And as you know, fats or oils and water don't mix. And so this is one of the unique properties of the cell membrane that allows or prevents water from crossing the cell membrane unless it's going through particular pores, and helps very much in this division between intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. The next structure we'll mention is the nucleus. Now, if there's one structure that you have probably heard about inside of the cell, it is the nucleus. And to the right, we have a very nice picture of the cell. As you look at that picture, I want to remind you, as you look at this image, that cells are three-dimensional structures. And this image brings that across very well. So often when we're studying and reading our textbooks or looking at videos, we might not appreciate the three-dimensional structure of a cell. But a cell is not a flat entity, but it actually has three dimensions. It has height, it has depth, and it also has breadth. And very often it will be like a small ball or a small circle. Sitting often in the center of the cell, one of the largest organelles, if not the largest, is the nucleus. And the nucleus contains your DNA, your genetic material. And DNA is very important because DNA codes for proteins. And proteins then go and do all the work in the body that make you you. So you can think of any particular feature that you might have, your eye color or your personality or how you learn. All of these things start with the activity of proteins forming things. And those proteins are coded by your genetic material. And so the DNA is stored within the nucleus. And when cells want to replicate, the first thing they have to do is replicate their DNA to ensure that every cell that comes after them has the same DNA. And this way, life is sustained and is able to function. So if we just look at our diagram here to the right, you can see the nucleus in the middle. But you also see the plasma membrane or the cell membrane that we just spoke about. And you can see many of the other structures that we're going to talk about. This is the mitochondria that we'll talk about next. These are your endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes and Golgi apparatus, which we'll also talk about. And a wonderful diagram. And let me say, students, any student of biology is supposed to be able to draw a typical animal cell and label that cell correctly. So this is the mitochondria. The mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell. We were just talking about the nucleus producing proteins and then proteins being the workhorses of the body. But if any work has to take place, it requires energy. Now, energy in the body is provided by a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the organelle, the structure that produces ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria has the unique ability to take glucose and to combine it with oxygen and to produce the ATP that we need in order to perform all the activities of the body. And so the mitochondria is often known as the powerhouse of the cell. The more active a cell, the more mitochondria you'll find within that cell. Finally, let's just talk briefly about the protein-making machinery of the cell. I told you that the nucleus contains the DNA, and the way the DNA is translated to change body structure and function is by producing proteins. And so all cells have a complex protein-making apparatus. Here in this image, you see some of the key structures. Here you see the endoplasmic reticulum, and located on the endoplasmic reticulum are the ribosomes. And the ribosomes work in conjunction with the endoplasmic reticulum, which comes off the nucleus to produce proteins. When these proteins are produced, they move over to the Golgi apparatus where post-production modifications take place before they are released into the cell and into the body to perform their functions. And so a large part of what the cell is it's a protein-making factory that then does all the work of your body. So those are some basic structures of a typical animal cell. Now within the nervous system, we have two types of cells. Previously, I would have mentioned to you the typical nerve cells, which we'll now refer to as neurons. And I would have indicated that there are about 85 to 86 billion neurons in your nervous system. And these are specialized cells that are designed to process information and to transmit that information as electrical signals that allow your body to function. However, within the brain is another type of cell, and within the nervous system is another type of cell. And these cells are called glial cells. And these are the supporting cells of your nervous system. They aren't processing information. They aren't transmitting electrical signals. But they are literally the glue that hold your brain together. The word glia literally means glue. And these cells are important in maintaining homeostasis, in nourishing the brain cells, in cleaning up debris, and in protecting the brain cells. So what we want to do now is just mention four types of glia, and talk briefly and comment about their properties and what's their function in the nervous system. And the four types of glial cells that we'll be talking about are the astrocytes, the microglia, the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, And you'll see in a little while why we've grouped those two together. And finally, the ependymal cells. Now, the most abundant glial cell in the nervous system are astrocytes. Astrocytes tend to have a typical star shape. And you can see an example of the astrocytes in this lovely image, bottom right-hand corner. We now have wonderful imaging techniques where we can image different cells of the nervous system with fluorescent dyes. And here the astrocytes have been labeled with a green fluorescent dye. And you can see the beautiful star shape that they all have. Now, the astrocytes are the supporting cells of the nervous system. They surround the nerve cells, they nourish the nerve cells, they help to maintain the microchemical environment of the brain, and they do that by a lot of homeostatic processes and regulating the fluid concentrations. They also wrap themselves around the blood vessels, creating the important blood-brain barrier, which regulates the composition or the flow of substances from the blood to the fluid around the brain, and ensures that the brain fluid has a slightly different composition from blood. And this is an important protective mechanism for the brain. More and more, we're finding that astrocytes are important for healthy brain function. And there's even some evidence now to suggest that astrocytes are important in signal processing by helping to regulate the amount of neurotransmitters in the brain. A specialized astrocyte is the microglia. The microglia can be termed the immune cells of the nervous system. And you know that the immune system of your body is designed to take care of you when something goes wrong. When foreign particles invade your body, such as bacteria and viruses in the forms of infection, or something's going wrong in your body and it's breaking down and the immune system has to work to restore that part of your body. Within the brain, we have specialized cells called microglia that perform this function. And you can see in their non-activated state, they have the typical star shape that we're talking about. But when something goes on in the brain that requires them to be activated, they get transformed. And they move into a much more amoeboid type shape that allows them to engulf the invading particles and destroy them. In this way, they can fight infection, and they can also be used to remove debris and other foreign cells from the nervous system. I'll make one last comment about microglia. More and more research is indicating that microglial activation and neuroinflammation is an important part of many chronic neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. So there's a lot of research activity focusing on the role of microglia and seeking to understand how microglia function both in health and in disease. Oligodendrocytes, a big word to describe this very important cell. This cell is important for forming the myelin sheath that surrounds many neurons. Now, we haven't reviewed the structure of the nerve cell as yet, but in this diagram, you can see that the typical nerve cell consists of two major components, the cell body, and this long process called the axon. And surrounding the axon is a fatty sheath, not sheet, sheath. And this sheath serves an insulating function, and we'll see the importance of that later on. And between each sheath is a gap, which is called the node of Ranvier. Now, these sheaths are created by cells in the nervous system. And in the central nervous system, the cell that creates this sheath is the oligodendrocyte. And you can see that one oligodendrocyte has several processes which wrap around different axons to form the myelin sheath. And it has been estimated that one oligodendrocyte can be responsible for interacting with up to 50 different neurons. So what are Schwann cells? Well, in the central nervous system, the cell that produces the myelin is the oligodendrocyte. But in the peripheral nervous system, the cell that produces the myelin is the Schwann cell. And whereas the oligodendrocytes tend to interact with many different axons at the same time, that doesn't tend to be typical of Schwann cells, which tend to actually have many Schwann cells for one axon. So just remember that Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes perform the same function, creating the myelin sheath for axons, but they are found in different parts of the nervous system. We're going to see the importance of myelin later, but let me just mention here that there are a number of diseases that are known as demyelinating diseases, in which the myelin sheath can be destroyed or broken down. And in this case, in these cases, it results in dysfunction within the nervous system and can often lead to death. And most typical, or the one that might be most familiar to you, is multiple sclerosis. This is a demyelinating disease. Finally, we'll just mention ependymal cells. These are a different group of cells, and they line the cavities of your brain and spinal cord, the ventricles and the spinal canal. They are much more like epithelia that are found inside of your mouth and in other parts of your body. Some of these cells are important for the production of cerebrospinal fluid, and those ependymal cells that produce cerebrospinal fluid, I've told you, are called the choroid plexus. So these cells line the they line the ventricles. They're important for the production of the cerebrospinal fluid and also for the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. And so those are 4 types of glial cells that serve very important homeostatic, protective, and other functions in the brain. The astrocytes, the microglia, the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, and the ependymal cells. Let's now turn our attention to the typical nerve cell. Now, the first person who really started to describe neurons for us was a Spanish anatomist, Ramon y Cajal. And he made this statement. He said, neurons are the most basic functional unit in the brain, which communicate with one another via contact and not continuity. He began to understand from very early on that neurons are not all connected to each other, but they speak to each other at spaces which we now call synapses. And the typical neuron has 4 or 5 parts: a cell body, an axon, dendrites, and terminal dendrites or terminal boutons. Here you can see another staining technique showing typical neurons inside of the brain. And here's a diagram that you need to know. You need to be able to draw a typical neuron. This is the cell body. Coming off of the cell body are the dendrites. But there is one very long process that comes off the cell body called the axon. And at the end of the axon are the axon terminals or the terminal boutons. And surrounding the axon is the myelin sheath. And in between the spaces of the myelin sheath, we've labeled those the nodes of Ranvier. And the beginning region of the axon is known as the axon hillock. The dendrites serve as the receptive point. They receive incoming signals and process this information. Before that information is sent as another signal via an action potential down the axon. And you can tell from this image that numerous dendrites can interact with other dendrites. And that gives rise to trillions of synapses, as demonstrated by this scanning electron micrograph of a neuron in the brain. This diagram here gives a more schematic approach of the same thing that we're talking about, just to allow you to have something to visualize, because this is very, very important, students, that you must be able to draw and label a typical nerve cell. Now, there are many ways of describing neurons, and majority of neurons are what we call multipolar neurons. In this case, there are many poles as a result of the dendritic tree and the location of the cell body. But in a couple of instances, you have what are called bipolar neurons, where the cell body tends to be more towards the middle. And then you have a long dendrite breaking up into much smaller dendrites and the axons. And then you can also have unipolar neurons, which have a very strange shape, where the cell body is off to the side before it gives rise to the axon and the dendrites. So this is just one way of classifying the typical neurons that are found in the body. However, let me say the vast majority of our neurons are multipolar neurons. And here are some wonderful diagrams showing the vast array of different neurons in the body. Look at this neuron here with its vast dendritic tree. This is typical of cells in the cerebellum, particularly the Purkinje cells. Okay. This is a typical cell found in the cerebral cortex, the pyramidal cell. Now, let me just briefly remind you that cells can be sensory, bringing information to the central nervous system, motor, taking information away from the central nervous system, and I've told you things before. But neurons that are neither sensory nor motor but exist entirely in the central nervous system, especially the spinal cord, we call interneurons. And so in this diagram here, you have an interneuron between the sensory and the motor cell. Okay. And neurons eventually talk to other neurons, muscles, or glands. And this is going to be very, very important because we're going to talk about the communication of neurons in a little while. And they can talk to other neurons, muscles, or glands, all of which are important in allowing the body to function. Finally, let me just make some comments on some other terminology that you would have already picked up inside of this course. When you stain the brain, areas can stain either gray or white, depending on what type of stains you use. Because a lot of the earlier stains use this gray and white difference, we talk about now gray matter and white matter. Now, gray matter is where the cell bodies of neurons are clustered, whereas white matter is where the axons of the neurons run between different parts of the central nervous system in tracts or bundles. Okay. In the CNS, we talk about tracts. In the peripheral nervous system, when axons cluster together, we call them nerves. And the reason they look white is because the myelin sheath gives it a white appearance. Now, in the central nervous system, you tend to have gray matter on the outside, and then you have an inner layer of white matter in the cortex. But when you get to the peripheral nervous system, here you have the white matter on the outside and the gray matter on the inside. It's simply just showing you where the cell bodies are and where the axons run in the various tracts and nerves. And I just wanted you to be aware of that so that you don't get confused going forward. So let's end there with that brief review of the cells of the nervous system. I encourage you to go into your textbooks to review this, and also go online, as there are many wonderful videos that show you these cells in 3 dimensions and as they've come to life. Thank you.